marks, as we say, the 49th, 50th anniversary of we're preparing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And there's a big fight underway over Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Now, I have a great book by Brad Meltzer that I read to my child about Martin Luther King Jr. and what Martin Luther King Jr. did for the United States and what he did for the black community inside the United States. It's one of my daughter's favorite books. She's growing up with it because I think that it is important for all children to know about the legacy of Dr. King. But one of the things that we tend to do in modern politics is, instead of remembering people for the things that they are actually remembered for, we go back and we look again. We do a revisionist history. We go back and we look again at all the things they did in their life. And then we say, well, this is really what we should be remembering. So, for example, George Washington, father of our country, right? Great general, first president. That's what we remember him for. But revisionist historians will go back and they will look at George Washington and they will say, well, he was a slave owner. We should talk about that because that's really his legacy. His real legacy is that he was a slave owner. Same thing's happening with Thomas Jefferson. His legacy is the Declaration of Independence and his involvement with the Constitutional Convention, right? He has a phenomenal legacy. He was the third president of the United States. But now there are calls to remove his monument specifically because parts of his legacy were associated with slavery, right? He was a lifelong slave owner. Yeah, this sort of logic has applied to everything. You see it even with Abraham Lincoln, where there's now an attempt going on to go back and recast Abraham Lincoln as a rabid racist because in some of his writings, he speaks in racist fashion, even though he was the great emancipator who ended slavery in the United States through the Civil War and through the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, Martin Luther King obviously doesn't have anything quite that checkered, slave owning or racism in his past. He does have some things in his past that we have conveniently overlooked, obviously. He was personally kind of a shambles in terms of his treatment of women, for example. But what we really remember Dr. King for and why we celebrate Dr. King, and I'm blessed that I shared my birthday with Dr. King's day, right? Martin Luther King Day is January 15th. That's my birthday. And I've always had a special fondness for that fact. But Dr. King, what we really remember him for is his message, which was not Malcolm X's message. So to understand Martin Luther King's message, you have to do it in contrast to Malcolm X prior to his conversion to actual Islam and his call for peace before he was assassinated by the folks over at the Nation of Islam, to which Democrats still pay homage, which is just an incredible thing, right? The people who assassinated Malcolm X are still going around claiming they didn't assassinate Malcolm X, and then heads of the Democratic Party are meeting with their leaders, like Louis Farrakhan. Should show you something about the state of today's modern politics. But Malcolm X's message was black militancy. His message was black separatism, at least in his early days when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And then later, he realized maybe we should look for a more conciliatory message. And Spike Lee's movie covers some of this ground. Okay, Martin Luther King's message was very different. His message was, we all have to come together around universal human rights that apply to black people as well as white people, that the calls of the founding fathers apply to black people as well as white people, like Booker T. Washington or like like Frederick Douglass. The call from Martin Luther King was fully within the American tradition. America has certain rights, inalienable rights, and these extend to black people. And to prevent black people from exercising these rights is an act of terrorism, an act of evil, an act of tyranny. Right? This was his basic message. And that message of racial reconciliation was why we honor Dr. King. If he had been a racial separatist like Malcolm X, we would not be honoring Dr. King. We would be talking about whether his legacy has helped contribute to the constant racial tensions in the country. The reason that Martin Luther King is considered such a great figure is because of the racial reconciliation. So, I mean, we'll play it because it is one of the great speeches in American history. This was his speech, the I Have a Dream speech from the Washington Mall. Here was Dr. King in his most famous iteration.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Right, okay, and this is because he spoke in these terms, it was obvious that Martin Luther King was bound to be an American hero. Obviously, his assassination was one of the great tragedies in American history because right on the verge of a civil rights movement that was to essentially bear his imprimatur, he was killed, right? It's just a horrifying story. In any case, President Trump tried to pay homage to Dr. Martin Luther King on the 50th anniversary of his assassination, and he spoke about that. He posted this on his Twitter yesterday. This, of course, caused a lot of consternation.
50 years ago, Dr. King was cruelly taken from this world by an assassin's bullet. But the promise he fought for could never be taken away. His words, his deeds, they live on forever. And the cause for which he gave his life only gained strength and force and power with the passage of time. On this cherished day, we honor the memory of Reverend King, and we rededicate ourselves to a glorious future where every American from every walk of life can live free from fear, liberated from hatred, and uplifted by boundless love for their fellow citizens. I ask every
Many people were
citizen
upset
to
about
join
this,
me-
right? A lot of people were very upset about President Trump putting this out because folks on the left think that President Trump is a racist, and they're unhappy with a lot of the racially conflagrationist things that Trump has said in the past, going all the way back to Charlottesville. The fact is, though, that what Trump is actually saying, right, separate the message from the man who's saying it, what he's saying here is the great American perception of Martin Luther King. So, in the mood of revisionist history, what is absolutely happening right now is that the left is going back and they're looking at Martin Luther King's entire legacy. And again, Martin Luther King was economically a socialist. Martin Luther King was somebody who did not really understand economics particularly well. Martin Luther King was somebody who was focused in on the supposed labor struggles of unions across the country. And so the left broadly has tried to take the great attachment we have to Martin Luther King and extend it to these other causes. So, for example, there's a piece today by Leonard Pitts Jr., who is a columnist, syndicated columnist, is in the Miami Herald, where he talks about Martin Luther King, and he talks about the assassination. He says, "Fear purchased the gun, delusion loaded it, ignorance adjusted the sight, intolerance pulled the trigger. 50 years ago, those forces killed the man. They have sought ever since to kill the memory." Now, again, I agree with what killed the man, right? But that was an individual assassin in a country that was still replete with racism. We're now 50 years down the road. The idea that we've spent 50 years burying Martin Luther King's memory is a bit insulting to all of the history of the United States subsequent to his assassination. But here is what Leonard Pitts says. And this, again, I think is the attempt to recapture the legacy of Martin Luther King and put him in the radical camp so that there can be a call today for more radicalism in politics, particularly on the racial side. He says, quote, "There's a myth some of us cherish, and it goes like this. There used to be racism in this country, a distant and benighted time about which it's best not to talk and impolite to even recall. Then Martin Luther King organized a boycott, led some marches, and gave a speech about a dream. And ever since, equality has reigned." Okay, that's obviously meant to be a caricature and a straw man. Obviously, it's not true. We should be teaching about Jim Crow. We should teach about slavery. We should teach about the legacy of those things. We should teach about the entire civil rights movement, including the Civil Rights Act, including Dwight Eisenhower sending federal troops down into the South in the mid-50s, including President Truman integrating the military. We should talk about the long struggle for justice in this country for black folks. We should talk about Martin Luther King, and we should talk about Malcolm X. It was a complex time with a lot of complex figures. We should talk about all those things. But there is no question that racism, since Martin Luther King's assassination, has depleted incredibly rapidly to the lowest point in certainly American history as of maybe 7 or 8 years ago before Barack Obama was elected. And then Barack Obama started, I believe, using intersectional politics as a substitute for unifying policy. But Leonard Pitts says, "This is a silly myth because it ignores the reams of evidence and towers of testimony proving that racism continues to stunt, blunt, and take the lives of people of color." Again, this is the point that folks on the left want to make. They want to say that Martin Luther King's legacy was a failure, essentially, that Martin Luther King did not succeed. It wasn't that he was Moses who goes up to the top of the mountain and sees the promised land and then perishes. It was that Martin Luther King dreamt of a promised land that we have never reached, that we are still wandering in the wilderness somewhere out here. And then Martin Luther King's legacy is basically that he says a bunch of things that we have failed to take him up on. Pitt says it's an offensive myth because it reduces King to an anodyne figure harmless enough to be embraced by conservatives who conveniently forget that while he was here, they stood against everything he stood for. First of all, that's not true. More Republicans than Democrats vote on a percentage basis in the Congress voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than Democrats. Southern Democrats were the ones who were standing in the way of Martin Luther King during the Selma marches and attempting to bludgeon him, and they were imprisoning him. It was not Republicans, okay? That was Democrats. So the idea that it was a bunch of conservatives who were standing in the way of Martin Luther King is not historically accurate. It was conservatives, in many cases, who were standing with Dr. King. Right? There were liberals, no question, who stood with Martin Luther King, and there were conservatives who stood with Martin Luther King. And to pretend otherwise, that is offensive, and that is a rewriting of history. But Pitts continues, "The forces that killed him used this myth to kill our memory of the provocative, radical, progressive prophet and preacher that he was. So successful had they been that Glenn Beck, with a straight face, claimed the mantle of King a few years ago, so successful that some people are indignant when it is pointed out to them that Colin Kaepernick is actually following King's example, so successful that King's youngest child, Bernice, recently tweeted how someone told her that her father didn't offend people." Well, I mean, maybe his youngest child knows Martin Luther King's legacy better than like Leonard Pitts, I might suggest. And using Colin Kaepernick as someone akin to Martin Luther King, that's an insult to Martin Luther King's legacy. Martin Luther King actually knew of what he talked. Martin Luther King actually had a program for change. Colin Kaepernick was looking for publicity, and he got publicity. I'm not saying that he doesn't have a good heart for what he thinks he is doing, but Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the anthem is something that Martin Luther King never would have done, because Martin Luther King understood that he was standing with America's legacy, not against America's legacy. That the darkness in America's history was an obstacle that was thrown in the way of founding ideology, that it was not part and parcel, rooted in our DNA, as Barack Obama was fond of saying.